Somebody give me a holler in live chat if you can hear me. Don't actually holler at me. Oh, Lord. Okay, stop. Excellent. We have sound. All right. So, hey, everybody. Welcome to ArchaeoCon. Yes, I'm screaming. I'm sorry. Welcome to ArchaeoCon 21. And I truly appreciate that everybody has come back for year number 2 of the ArchaeoGaming convention. Completely online, completely free. It's going to be streamed through Twitch. You might see it on Facebook as well and YouTube, and then it will be archived on YouTube. So if you can't catch these live, you will be able to rewatch them on YouTube. And I think we just set it up so that you can actually watch them for up to 2 weeks here on Twitch. So pick your poison, enjoy. Before we get started, I want to make sure to say thank you to everybody in the ArchaeoCon Discord who has worked their butts off to make this happen. Whether you put the schedule together for me, Christiana, thank you so much, or did the majority of the overlays and artwork, which would be Anna and Amy, or you decided that the Phasmophobia needed all this really crazy stuff for the Friday night Fright Night, which will be tonight. That's everybody's names. I'm not even going to try. Thank you, everybody, for your hard work in this. The con should go through, hopefully, without a hitch. If you're new to this, this is the internet. This is live. There will probably be a hiccup here and there. But in the past year since we did this the first time in August, which I'm sure everybody can remember why this happened in August, it's interesting to me that we are doing it once again. So everybody, thank you for showing up. And I wanted to give a special shout out to Mike for making this awesome little dude of mine. This made me cry when I got it, and this really helped me with a mental state that I was in that was actually preventing me from being as excited about all of this as I felt like I should have been. So I really want to say thank you to Michael, and I really want to say to everybody who has been having a rough time since last August, I'm there for you. I understand. I hope you can enjoy this con, and I hope this will bring some levity to the past year. But all of that being said, if you are new to what ArchaeoGaming is, I have a fabulous interview coming up that will hopefully explain what ArchaeoGaming is to you. But the short end of it is the intersection of archaeology and gaming, the two worlds colliding. We study video games, we study RPGs, we study pen and paper, we study million-year-old dice that are dug up in Roman cities. If it has to do with any form of gaming, we are there. A lot of the stuff that we have this year is going to be very video game focused, but I think that's because so much of the world has shifted online and shifted to video games, and a lot of gaming occurs in the digital format. But a really interesting thing about all of this is that digital worlds have become real worlds. They are tangible, real worlds where people spend real amounts of time and people do real work in them. And anytime you're touching something with human hands and anytime human beings are making something, it instantly becomes an artifact. It instantly becomes material culture. And that is what archaeology is. It is the study of the human condition through material culture. So once again, thank you all for joining us for year 2. Thank you all for listening to me ramble for, I don't know how long this took. And now please give me a moment to transition us into our first interview for the official ArchaeoCon 21, and I will see you guys again at 4 to talk about Green Hell. But here we are talking with Dr. Megan Rhodes Victor about the actual intersection of archaeology and gaming. And thank you all. Goodbye. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Gaming Convention 2021. I didn't mess up my own con. And today I am interviewing Dr. Megan Rose Victor. Did I get that right? Look at me, 2 for 2. And we are going to talk about the basics of what ArchaeoGaming is. Like why, like I've already done an intro, so we know why we're doing an ArchaeoGaming con and why that's important and why archaeology and gaming are important. But I figured I should have an expert here to explain to everybody why ArchaeoGaming is a thing and why it's important. So can you give us a quick bio, Dr. Victor, and tell us everything about yourself or everything you want us to know about you?
So I am currently an assistant professor at Queens College, CUNY in New York, and I am an anthropological archaeologist specializing in historical archaeology. And just sort of in a tiny nutshell, the three things I kind of look at are narratives of underrepresented communities, including the LGBT community. I look at commensal politics and drinking spaces, so the archaeology of taverns and saloons, and I look at archaeogaming. And often the three of those things braid together so that sometimes I'm doing everything all at once, which is glorious, and sort of the best research is research that keeps kind of feeding back onto itself. So that's sort of what I do in the smallest of nutshells. I got my PhD at the College of William and Mary, and that's also where I got my master's. I was from University of Michigan.
Nice. I don't have that much of a pedigree.
I went to IU. I use great.
Good school. Good. Yeah, no, it's a good school. It's just this is where I went. So you were talking about braiding real world archaeological topics that people are more comfortable with, especially in an academic space, which we're gonna try to not use a ton of jargon here. But the three topics that you brought up are actually pretty popular or they're at least interesting, and people say they're interested in them. And if you presented a paper on those, you'd probably have a pretty good turnout because it's a cool topic. And then we have archaeogaming, which it's still a new field. It's been around for a while now. And like the whole concept of studying games archaeologically has been around since I think the 70s, maybe a little bit before that. But like we've kind of elevated it to the next level. And, a lot of the presentations that'll be at this con are talking about video games as archaeological space. And, you were talking about in an interview that you did earlier about material culture inside of video games. I really loved your example of the sock. I love little details like that in games. Like one of my biggest things are the ants on the tree in Elder Scrolls Online. So how do you as a researcher, like you said, braid all of those topics together, like your underrepresented communities along with drinking spaces and then the game space itself? How do you balance
That's a fantastic question. Honestly, the best thing is that when you look at archaeogaming, and I'm happy to sort of back up at any point and kind of just discuss the key points of archaeogaming, whenever you'd like. But when you look at it, it really is just another way of sort of studying the archaeology of play and the archaeology of place. And we do this so often in so many archaeological fields. And so doing it through sort of the digital space instead of what some archaeogaming scholars, including Andrew Reinhardt, have sort of described as almost like the meatscape, right? Which is, sort of the IRL, right?
Yeah.
But, right. We're looking at similar themes. We're looking at communities because a game that's successful is one that resonates with people. It's got to be, people always say, oh, that's so believable. Well, it's not believable if it doesn't resonate on some human level. As anthropologists, we're constantly looking at these commonalities that make us understand one another, or if things don't make sense, we try and pick and probe and try and figure out why doesn't that make sense, right? So if you zoom out, and I'm not avoiding your question, right, but if you zoom out, look at archaeogaming itself, right, that it's basically got three main components. And so the first one is literally looking at the stuff that's produced by video games themselves. And so that's pretty easy for an archaeologist in general to mix in to their daily life. And that would work even for me too, right? But that would be, the material culture that they produce. So the game systems and the controllers and the boxes that everything came in and the instruction manuals, the game guides, etc. Right? So all this paraphernalia.
Right.
And so, if I were to braid it into my own research, if I'm looking at drinking spaces, I could look at, often what I look at with drinking spaces is sociability. Well, how many, couch co-ops are there and things like that you're playing, where it's a sociable thing. You come over to do insert game here, or you hop online to join your friends in something. And sometimes you're like, okay, hang on, don't start the raid yet. I have to go get a drink, and whether it is water or alcohol, you've got sociability and it's involving food and drink, even if you're not necessarily in the same room, but you're holding material culture and you're all holding the same ones. You're all holding that PlayStation controller or that mouse, so already I can braid it in and start looking.
So I want to back up just real quick. And can you define
yes,
sociability?
Absolutely. So sociability is literally it's sort of the noun form of being sociable, right? It is the way that we interact with one another. And so sociability is literally the togetherness that is experienced. And so when I say I study sociability, it's sort of like, what is it about this environment that makes you want to stay and hang out with your friends? And what is it that motivates you to keep coming back? What are these sort of factors? And so you can say, well, maybe it's alcohol, or maybe it's just, well, yeah, there's alcohol at a lot of places. Why do you go to that bar and not this one? Or things like that.
And that blends very easily into game spaces because a lot of open world games, especially, are designed to do that, to make you want to come back and socialize with your friends in your guilds or your raiding parties and that kind of stuff. So that's a natural progression right there. So what made you, as a researcher, decide that you were going to even look at ArchaeoGaming as an academic field, as opposed to just being like, games?
As opposed to just I like games, I like archaeology, but never the twain shall meet. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of people that do that, and I'm not trying to throw shade. It's just, what made you decide to pursue gaming as an archaeological research?
Yeah.
There we go.
So it's honestly, it kind of falls into the sort of one of the second things that defines archaeogaming, and that it's like the portrayal of archaeology within video games, whether it's the perceptions of the field or actual archaeology representations or these overtones of what academia and the ivory tower and such are. I found myself, as I was playing more and more games, I found certain things that kept hitting on my research themes. And so at one point, I was doing some sort of quest. I want to say it was maybe either in Elder Scrolls Online or in Skyrim. And it was kind of like, well, if you really want to get the information, but be quiet about it, go to the local tavern and just sit there for a couple of minutes and take a listen. And I was like, this is what I write about, but in the 1700s, like what? And so I happily moved my tune over to the tavern. And while you're actually in the tavern, of course, then the cutscene started, right? So all you had to do was walk in and poof, which is magical. But at the same time, I'm nerding out so hard. I'm shaking my wife's shoulder, and I'm like, this is what I study. And she's like, yes, I know, I'm here for it, but at the same time, I was so excited, right? And then, someone was like, oh yeah, they'll never hear us here. Come sit in the corner. There's so much noise with the food and the drink and the conversations and all this alcohol. They'll never know what we're talking about. And I was like, yes, that's why the American Revolution was planned in the Green Dragon and and in the Raleigh Tavern. That is literally this happened in life. Yes, and so that was the first thing that kind of bing. And so then I was like, maybe there's something more than just me, being a nerd and really enthusiastic, on my couch at home. And so then I started looking more for it. And it turns out a lot of sort of the things I researched were popping up in the game. And so, when I was looking at material culture and trying to see, all right, well, we know archaeologically that what we find is just a fraction of what happened, that all we have are these broken, fragmented, shattered remains of past behavior. So then I was playing games, and I was going through these old ruins, and there were these quests that were like, well, here's a little bit. I wonder if we can reconstruct, what had happened. And I was like, this would be a perfect way to visualize this for my students. And then all of a sudden, everything was a teachable moment. I was like, I've got to look into this further.
I really do like the way you described like how we put the past together, like these broken fragments of the past behavior, because it is what it is. I mean, everybody always jokes, oh well, what do we study? We study people's trash, because we kind of do. At least historical people, that's what we study. Give me your trash. I want to look at it for
but you know,
real.
we study the fractured, like frozen moments of behavior, right? Because if someone used 5 objects to do a thing in the past, archaeologically we might find one of them. You know, the one that was disposable or the one that they accidentally broke. I mean, so we get fractions of past behaviors. You know, we don't even get the whole thing. Like you'd get a whole tea set if there was some horrible thing where you had to leave it all of a sudden. If you had someone who was really forgetful and they like buried it and wanted to come back and didn't, or if someone had a really bad day and dropped the whole tea server. Like that's the only time we'd get that are these oops moments. Otherwise, you get just pieces of
it. Yeah. I think about the research that people have been doing with the food archaeology, where they're taking residual. They're taking the residual stuff left. I don't. Clearly, this isn't my field. The residual stuff that's inside the pots and everything, and they can get like a chemical breakdown of what it is, and they can guess what the ingredients might have been, but you don't know how those ingredients were put together. Like maybe you know that there's an onion and a carrot and a pepper, but you don't know what they were doing with the onion and the carrot and the pepper. Like were they diced? Were they stewed? Were they chopped?
We can sometimes look at how broken down the residue is in the residue analysis, and we can look at that and we can actually say, okay, well, because it's been broken down this much, we know that it was probably boiled instead of that because this happens to the starch grain as it goes through these processes. And so yeah, it ends up really neat.
But I mean, it's still not giving us like the complete picture of, you know, what did that meal look like when it was done? You know, did they garnish it after it came out of the pot? Was it stuffed into something else and then cooked again?
Yeah.
You know, anybody who cooks understands
well,
there's
multiple
3 people steps
to make
these things. And it's
that looks the same and only one tastes good, you know. Right.
Yeah, you have no idea what it tastes like. It's like, it was food. Because one of the things I like to look at is food represented in games to portray culture. Because I like how, because I've really gotten really big into ESO, and I keep saying it wrong, so it's Elder Scrolls Online.
ESO,
yep. Yeah, I said it right this time.
Yeah, I take a look at the food too, anyway, and recreate it actually at home. So
yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how to best recreate the cheese that's made out of bugs, but I haven't. I think I have an idea, but I'm not brave enough to try it yet. I'm like, you could use lobster and crab and shrimp because they're all technically bugs, and if anybody knows what I'm talking about, you're there. So as an archaeologist studying these different spaces, I think what I want to ask is, because I want to talk about the Oregon Trail, but I don't know if I want to jump into it just yet, because there's a lot of interesting things that happened with the Oregon Trail, especially the reboot of it. But what is your favorite game space right now to be studying, as part of your
hands
study?
Down, it's the whole TES franchise, the whole Elder Scrolls franchise. And currently it's Elder Scrolls Online.
Do you like the online world? Are you looking forward to the new game that's coming out?
Elder Scrolls 6. I am super looking forward to it. I think I'll probably be like 75 when it comes out, but I'm really, really excited. And I understand, obviously, the game studios they've got all these projects in the pipeline and you've got to get them done. It's the same thing when a company's like, why isn't this finished? I was like, because you sent me on 3 other projects to excavate first. Like, I get it. I do get it. Right. Yes, I'm ridiculously excited about it. But I've really been enjoying Elder Scrolls Online. It's allowed me to look at a lot of social interaction in a way that the single player format actually didn't. So there's a lot that I was able to kind of look at with Oblivion, Morrowind, Skyrim, things like that. But there's actually a lot going on in ESO that I almost get the benefit of the fact that there's other people. And some of them are people I know quite well, and I definitely wrote my guildies into stuff. But there are also things where I just kind of watch and see where people congregate. And it's really interesting to watch because it sort of mimics, I guess what would be seen as like IRL, right, or in real life sort of clustering, that people are still gathering in open public spaces. There are still other areas where people are not going to be. people are hanging out in taverns. I just recently found out, at least on PS4 NA server, that there's a certain tavern that you can go to in Evermore if you're looking for other people to RP with. Um, and so you have to,
So that's the
it's
RP
the RP
tavern.
right? And that's where you would go, and then you can kind of put in like in Say chat rather than in Zone chat. You can sort of put in like an LFG, and so the fact that there are these smaller subgroups that are based around things like that, I find fascinating, because that reminds me a lot of like the Molly House research I do, where it's sort of like you have to know where to go and who to talk to, but then once you do, you can be in, and so it's just
it's like a quest created by the players as opposed to a quest.
That's right. Yeah, and like who decided that, that this particular tavern versus that particular tavern, or this one, like why? It's really interesting.
Yeah. Why this space versus another space. Do you think that, sticking with this, do you think that the reason that the spaces in game are being used is because the game mimicked what we think we know about the medieval world? It's so medieval and accurate. But do you think that because the game is mimicking that, they purposefully created spaces that are being used that way? Or do you think the player, as opposed to like the players being like, oh, I really like this clearing in the game, this random clearing in the game, this is where we're all going to congregate, whereas because we don't really have to eat, we don't really have to drink in game, but yet where the food and the drink are, that's where you're gonna find people. That
and the way shrines and you get the exact same thing where the way shrines act like inns would have in reality, in that they are places to group, places to meet. There, if someone says, okay, I'm traveling to you, they come in at the way shrine in Alinor, right?
At the way shrine,
whereas like in reality they would come in and you'd meet them at insert in here, but we've kind of have inn and tavern almost separated in ESO, where you've got the way shrines and anything else where you can sort of fast travel. But you've got the way shrines as a travel location, and then you've got these inns. But people gather there like crazy, anyways. I don't think it has anything to do with the sort of kind of semi-medieval fantasia that's sort of there, because it's definitely kind of a cross between, like, there's definitely some heavy Tudor influences and some Renaissance influences and some medieval influence. I mean,
oh yeah, I mean, depending on what zone you're in, I mean, you can clearly see the culture that they're trying, or the cultures.
They mix. There's like 3 to 4 for each racial style. Yeah, and it's something that like I've spent way too many hours sort of devolving into, especially like with some of my lore obsessed guildies. We're like, okay, this is kind of a combination of like, sort of Thai material culture for weaponry, and then you combine it with So, but anyways, I think what it honestly is that it plays off of the fact that when you have a bunch of humans in one space, you end up getting sort of a microcosm of what's going on. So we have these MMOs, these massively multiplayer online things, but we're still humans. We may be RPing as pets or as elves or whatever, but we're still people behind the tunes. And so we're still going to act in certain ways. I wouldn't say that, we're predictable in a robotic way, but there's trends that start to emerge that as anthropologists we're kind of used to seeing. And so people are going to gather at waypoints, people gather at places with food and drink, and then easier to find places are going to be something that attracts a lot of people, and then more out of the way places are where people might want to gather to do more private things, so that's where people may want to end up having, like, there's a certain town in this, or a certain tavern in Evermore where you go if you want to join this, but then you have to use Say Chat. People that have public auctions, they often choose to do them far away to avoid crowds, to avoid trolling and people bidding that aren't supposed to, and things like that.
Right. And just in general, like spamming the chat, so that's kind of like a courtesy thing, and I appreciate that. Thank you for those people that do that. I'm also thinking of games like Fallout 76, which is something I play, and I know people hated it when it came out. I like the game. Deal with it, y'all. But the servers on there are random. So you don't have, unless you buy for the private world, and even then I think you can only have like 8 people in your private world at a time. but on the open worlds, you can be thrown in with a random group of a bunch of people, and depending on when you go in, depends on how busy it is. It's not the same as when I log into my Elder Scrolls game, because I'm always going to the same server every time. I can talk to the same people. I can connect with the same people. But with a game like 76, like, it's a random group of people every time. And there's many a quest where you have to work together with a bunch of random people. And I've noticed that in that game, there aren't gathering points unless it's a quest issue. Like, we all have to go set off the nuke codes to get rid of the dragon. You'll find people mustering for that. But there's the way, I think it's called the Wayward, which is supposed to be the newbie area where everybody goes when you very first start, and you get your beginner quests there. And I think there's some other quests that happen along the storyline. You're usually the only person there. I mean, maybe there'll be one other person, but you don't see a lot of people interacting. Clearly, you're not auctioning things off in the game space. That happens off in user-generated spaces on the internet, which is also part of ArchaeoGaming, is looking at
it's
those.
that digital culture. It's material in a way because it's leaving a digital signature. It's still an artifact, and so it's still associated paraphernalia.
Right.
I think it speaks to, part of the reason I wonder that it had some of the reception that it did was because it bucked that trend. 76. The other thing is that it speaks well to its actual premise that, Elder Scrolls Online, as much as they're saying, okay, well, this Daedric prince is trying to destroy the world. Okay, well, now this one is. Okay, well, now there's this threat, right? Society has not collapsed, right? There are towns, there are social hierarchies, there are people in charge, there are outlaws, refuges with their own ranking kind of system thing going on. There's this, there's that, there's this guild, there's that guild, right? There's all these sorts of things. It's a fully functioning, multicultural, diverse society. Whereas 76 really does represent the sort of, what the heck just happened? Like, we are the first people to kind of come blinking back out after the madness. And it is, it's closer to that Flashpoint than just about any other of the Fallout games, which have some distance. Whether you're looking at the pit or you're looking at New Vegas or you're looking at Fallout 4, they're all more removed. Where you're the one who's kind of like, what the heck's going on? And people are like, we've been here. But I think because of that sort of jarring, fragmented aspect of it really does accurately point out the lack of a societal structure, right? It shows the gaping holes in what's wrong, and yet you are still coming together to do certain things, right? There's nothing that says you have to do a quest. You can turn the game off, but you're choosing to do it. And so rather than being like, well, I'm going to go try and do it on my own anyways, I don't care. Like you do band up.
Well, yeah, I mean, with the 76 storyline, you can't finish the storyline without working with a group at some point, because it's not designed for solo play. And they did that on purpose, which is fine. But yeah, very much like you're saying, what I really enjoy about 76 is the whole aspect of, as an archaeologist, we look at an empty room and we see the story in the empty room. And that's kind of how 76 hits me. It's like the whole world is empty. And, you walk around and yeah, you can play the storyline and it'll move you through the story of the world. But you can also just walk around and see the random stuff that obviously the game developers have put in there, because none of this is randomly generated. So it's all stuff that somebody somewhere was like, this needs to be in the game. But I'm thinking of like this one picture that I took of a half-buried Mr. Jingles doll. And there's a gnome with a shovel standing near. So it looks like the gnome has buried the Mr. Jingles doll. And I'm just like, so random.
And Bethesda is really known for those kind of touches. They do, because they do it in a lot of the test franchise too, where you'll just stumble into a clearing and there'll be something that has been lovingly put there, like a bunch of Skeletal Khajiit holding instruments. You're like, why is this here? But
exactly. But there's a story that's happened there, even though it seems random. Somebody thought that up. Someone was like, okay, there's a skeletal band. well, as an archaeologist, what was going on? Like, why are there these 6 random remains here, and they're all clearly playing an instrument? I mean, if I could get hands on with it, I could probably find more information. But we have to use just our visual cues.
And
So that's what I really enjoy about the games, is like seeing that stuff and seeing the stories
oh,
behind the
absolutely.
stories, or the story within the story.
Absolutely.
So,
And then
but I'm a
sometimes the
nerd.
Easter eggs that are in there too, there's certain, you can find certain skeletons throughout both Skyrim and Elder Scrolls Online that have arrow wounds, like in the knee, to play off of that running
In the
joke.
knees.
And there's just various other references. There's things that like happen to NPCs in Skyrim that are mimicked, or in Morrowind, or even Oblivion now, that are mimicked in some of the things in ESO. So there are these little throwbacks that you get if you've played it, and so it's this other level of knowledge that's sort of these signifiers that are happening, but they're not so strange that people who haven't played are like, I don't understand what just happened. Like you can read it on one level,
Right.
but there's these signifiers that are signifying to people who can read it on a second level too.
And I think that's really important. See, that's where my inner archaeologist really starts to geek out, because at this point, the game developers are using material culture to tell a story and to harken back to lore from another game, which is basically kind of an oral tradition that's being passed on via the game. And I mean, it all just comes together for me in that aspect of it.
And the lived experience, because they're also harkening not just back to the lore if you want to stay like canon, right, and live in the world, but they're also harkening back to the player's lived experience of, I remember doing that when I played this, games, right? Yeah. And so it brings back nostalgia, and it brings back those memories. And the fact that the intro trailer for Dark Heart of Skyrim opened with you in a wagon, right? Like everyone was like, "Oh my gosh!" Right? Like that's not lore specific, right? But that's playing back to our lived experiences of first turning on Skyrim.
Right. But it creates that connection. And it's something that can be passed on to people who didn't play Skyrim. See, and this is where the oral comes in, because like you've played the game, you remember waking up on the wagon, and then you've got a new player who comes in, sees the intro, and it's like, oh, that's a really cool video, and then you're like, yeah, I remember XYZ. And so then that starts the tradition there. We're about a half hour into this, and I really wanted to, on your last interview, you were talking about a game that many of us of my generation will remember, Oregon Trail. And I know there's a newer version of it that came out, but I really like the game as an artifact, because it is a game that has spanned many a generation and is still popular. Yeah. I don't understand why people like Dysentery so much, but apparently we do. Can you tell us about
Sure.
Oregon Trail?
Absolutely. In a previous interview, which was just a fantastic interview that I'd had with the company Ritual Motion. Thank you. I was really impressed with the interviewer. I thought she did a great job. So not so much shame on horn, but it was great to be able to like nerd out on a public platform rather like this. But anyways, one of the questions had been asked, which was, is there a game that you think does like accurate really well, and is there one that does it like really shoddily? And I was like, actually, I have one game that does all of the above. And it is Oregon Trail, right? In that, especially I think because of its origin, right? So it first came out in 1971, and
right.
We most know about like the 1980s versions of it, because in 1971 it was kind of a test thing. It went out to a couple of schools, but it was sort of really just this kind of like, maybe we can use this newfangled computer thing to teach people. And now, of course, ArchaeoGamers are like claiming for like, hey, did you know that you can use Assassin's Creed to teach people about insert ancient civilization here? But it really came like into everyone's memory somewhere between like 1985 and 1995, when it went from first Apple and then to PC. And by 1995, it produced a third of the company that made it, which was the Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, or MEC, which people just normally call it. It produced a third of their $10 million annual revenue. So that's $10 million in 1995, right? So this was huge. So it meant They were doing something
Yeah.
right. You know, we can look at the historical accuracy of it, we can fight it or whatnot, but it was doing something that was resonating. Because these purchases were not, I'm going to get it and just play it at home. A lot of these purchases were by entire school districts. And then it never really stopped being a game, but it kind of sort of fell by the wayside. And then in 2008, which was sort of like the year of all things 90s nostalgia, it seems, right? You know, like sort of the late 2000s and such, into the, excuse me, into like the 2010s, you know, we get the renewal of Digimon and Pokemon and all the other things, right? And so 2008, we get a cell phone version of the game. And by 2011,
Yes.
over 65 million copies were sold for Oregon Trail, which is just like, that's a huge number of people that are, you know, still trying to go and get dysentery and things like that, right? And so, you know, what is the game doing right, even inherently in its initial thing, right? So it was all about teaching about provisioning. Like, did you know that you couldn't just leave St. Louis and just piss off to the edge of the map and hope for the best, right? Did you know that? Right? Did you know that you actually had to have, you know, this amount of food and this amount of rations, and the amounts were astronomical for a kid who was like, I have Dunkaroos in a small packet, right? You know, and all of a sudden you're talking about things in barrels and bushels and just filling up the entire thing, and then you have to choose, like, do I want food or medicine or a shovel, right, or gun, you know, so now you have to pick. And so it taught about navigation and provisioning and disease and just how difficult it was to go west, right? And so all of these were really important. However, it focused on one story. It really focused on white families who could afford enough to head west in the first place as a part of a wagon train, because not everyone went west as a part of a wagon train. There were other ways you could get there, and there were even other ways to head west. You know, you could sail, going south. There were a bunch of different ways. But if you were taking the Oregon Trail, you had to have a certain amount of money to be able to join the train. And so the dangers it spoke about, though, they were really, really real. Disease, wild animals, the weather, swollen rivers. Like, I remember losing so many oxen trying to cross a ford. And I was like, it turns out I'm really bad at fording. Like, 10 out of 10 would have died trying to cross the Oregon Trail. Like, I learned that early on, very early on, you know, like age 3, I knew I was dead, you know. But, you know, the thing is that, right? Oh, it was brutal. Right? And so, you know, and it plays into this allure and the mythos of the American West too, right? Because it portrays it as this harsh and rugged thing that needs to be endured and conquered to be claimed. And all of these obstacles are real. They were very real. You know, at no point did Oregon Trail exaggerate about diseases, dysentery, right? Or any of the other things that you went through.
Yeah,
right. There were other things, yes. So maybe the statistical probability of catching dysentery in Oregon Trail was slightly higher, but I mean, it was insane. And you can still walk like the Oregon Trail path, and you can see there's artifacts all along it where people hucked things out of the wagon at a certain point because they were overloaded, and to try and have the oxen or the horses keep going, to try and lessen the load, to try and make room so and so could lay out better because they were writhing in pain from a snake bite, from dysentery, from this, from that, right? So, I mean, if you follow the trail, you can see artifacts just hucked out to the sides, you know? And so, you know, and there's then a lot of archaeology on this, right? But what's inaccurate about the initial game is that one of these environmental threats that was seen as an obstacle to conquer were American Indians. And that's not accurate, right? It's not historically accurate. It certainly fits the, you know, the mythos of manifest destiny, where, you know, magical white people are going to go out and do whatever it is that magical white people do. But in reality, what actual white people did was that, you know, they were trying to find a better life, etc. I get it, but they were doing this by traipsing their way through other people's homes, you know, messing with the ecosystem, and often picking fights, things like that, right? And so the thing is that basically it becomes inherently dehumanizing to either say that there's no conflict, right? So to just take American Indians out altogether and have it be like this weird bubble, but it's also completely dehumanizing to say that they're inherent aggressors or that they're just part of the landscape. Like, today I fought 3 mountain lions, 2 wolves, and an Indian, right? Like, you can't do that because they're people. And so that was sort of the issue, right? So the trail, it wound through their home. And so it created, obviously, these substantial changes to their daily lives and their environment. And so it's nuance that was missing. right? The provisioning stuff, that was accurate. And yes, there were scuffles that broke out on the Oregon Trail. Like, there totally were. Like, that's not a lie. However, the nuance was missing. And so the newly released Oregon Trail captures a lot of that sort of teaching aspect, still plays off the nostalgia, but it takes a much more nuanced approach to Oregon Trail and the narrative, and it just came out, sort of this year. And so it's no longer just like, oh, the Indians killed someone on your wagon train. That's super unfortunate. Better look next time, tiny headstone in the corner, right? Right now what you end up getting is like literally, so the creative director for Gameloft, he literally said that one of his overt goals was to seek out the historical inaccuracies in the previous game and these cliches and try and fix them. So he reached out to archaeologists and professors and indigenous consultants. And he was like, okay, here's our game. How do we make it better? Because we still want to release it. And we know some stuff is accurate. Like, we know that there were scuffles and things, but how do we fix it? And so everyone, pretty much to an individual, was like, okay, this weird broken stilted English and the like heavy tribal drums and flutes, like, you don't need that. Also, not every American Indian tribe always wears their hair in braids. Like, that is also not a thing. There are other roles that American Indian can be other than person who tried to kill you, trapper, or guide. Like, there are other things in life. And so finally, there was this really big obsession, even currently, where they were like, we saw the impact of how cool bows were in a lot of MMOs and how cool bows were in like Horizon Zero Dawn. So we really wanted to have bows. And the consultants were like, that's great. Then make a different game, because bows were outdated by the time of Oregon Trail. And if they were used, it was in very specific circumstances, the way people use bows today. Like, you use them for a function, not like all the time always have a bow. And so they actually relented, and they're like, all right, so now they're armed with period accurate weaponry to do the job they need to do. Big game this, small game that, self-defense this. And so everyone got better and more accurate names too that were made as a result of consultation, right? So it wasn't just these sort of cliche kind of almost like Facebook quiz, what is your Indian name? Super horrible, insensitive things. But instead they became a lot more nuanced. And by becoming more informed and more nuanced, it became more accurate. And so it's an amazing example of a game that tried to be educational in the beginning, missed in some aspects, was correct in other. And so it was enough that, like, if the whole thing was a mess, they would have just thrown out. But it had great success because not only was it fun, but people were like, I'm actually learning a thing and I can play a video game in school, which is, again, here's the benefit of ArchaeoGaming going together, learning about the past through video games. But now what we have is something where, consultation took place. And this is something we as anthropologists and archaeologists do all the time, where we're like, okay, here's the site. We would like to get your advice. This isn't my story to tell.
At least that's what we're supposed to
do, right? Community engagement, stakeholder engagement, right, is reaching out to these underrepresented communities. The whole point is that you want them to not be underrepresented anymore. You want the opportunity to tell their story. The best thing possible is to have them no longer be underrepresented so that everybody is represented, and then you just have narrative.
Yes. And I mean, you can, the story that can be told.
Exactly.
Oh, crap. I just broke my...
No way.
Sorry. Anyway. So I have a love-hate relationship with Oregon Trail, mainly because, like, I sucked at that game and I have nothing but bitter memories of everyone dying. But I am really impressed with... It's not the same game. I mean, it's the same game in name and obviously the same company, but, like, the fact that it has evolved is fabulous, in my opinion, as an advocate for underrepresented groups in games or in life in general. But I think as an artifact or as an example of ArchaeoGaming, I think the Oregon Trail is like the perfect example. I mean, a lot of people go back to the ET game dig that Andrew Reinhardt was part of and mentions in his book, also titled ArchaeoGaming, which is fun, and it is still ArchaeoGaming, and it's a example of Meat World ArchaeoGaming, because they physically they found the giant grave site of all of the ET games and they dug them up again.
To everybody, we had a camera malfunction, so now you get to see my lovely desk cam for the rest of this, but it is what it is. So we just finished talking about Oregon Trail, or I was rambling about Oregon Trail. We have talked about Elder Scrolls. I want to give you the last 20 minutes of this interview to kind of hit on topics that you think are important for other people, not archaeologists, or maybe even archaeologists, to know about archaeogaming as a discipline and as a field.
Sure. I like how open that is. That's fun. Feel free to step in and guide at any point too.
No, I'm going to turn the camera off and I'm going to go
hey, that
make
sounds
lunch.
good. Sounds
I mean,
good. Yeah, just
you're
send me
good.
some
No,
pizza and I'm cool with it. No. Okay, so then I guess what I would probably do is I would come back around to foreground ArchaeoGaming at its heart. Because I think that
okay.
may be the best thing, especially as an intro to the larger con, right? I think
That's true. That's true.
ArchaeoGaming, we really, at its heart, while we say that it's the intersection of video games and archaeology, it's so much more complex than that. And that most
It
often,
is.
no two ArchaeoGaming scholars are looking at the same thing, the same way that you could say that no two scholars of food and commensality, which is the study of food and drink, right? Studying the same thing, or anyone who looks at any other insert specialty here are studying the same thing. And so I think that that's really important, just to inherently put out there. And so that, the three main components, we discussed two of them already, right? That it's the archaeology of video games themselves, right? That goes back to that dig that you were talking about, right? But literally all the stuff that's produced, and that includes material and the digital artifacts that are produced, game logs and all that stuff too. And then that second component is that portrayal of archaeology within video games, whether it's sort of like, now we see the archaeologist, or whether it's here's doing archaeology, or things that have an archaeological flavor to them. So, something like Nathan Drake, where he never says he's an archaeologist. All along, he's like, I'm a treasure hunter. I get paid. But he does things that are archaeological. Tomb Raider is the same thing. Like, it's in her name for Lara Croft, right? She never says, like, I am an archaeologist. She's like, I raid tombs. It is my name. And yet, a lot of people think of that when they think of archaeology. Whereas, like, Indiana Jones does what, like, Nathan Drake and Lara Croft are doing, but says he's an archaeologist, But it's these perceptions and playing off of these sort of overtones that archaeology has. And so there's also these overtones of, when you think of an archaeologist, what do you think of? You think of, treasure and adventuring and academia, colonization, community service, detective work, and so they're myriad. They're really widely varied. And they're all different things that you can sort of study. And then the last thing, and we touched on it a bit, especially when you were talking about the food, or you were talking about sort of things that were left behind in the world of Fallout 76, is literally approaching these built digital worlds with an archaeological eye. So rather than looking as an archaeologist at the stuff, or looking at the portrayal of archaeologists, literally looking at the digital landscape as if it were not inherently a digital landscape. So doing archaeology just in the digital world. And so, walking and conducting pedestrian survey, observing landforms, observing ruins, and trying to speculate, okay, well, if we have a cornerstone here, and we have a hearth over here, what might this building have looked like before its collapse? What are we actually looking at? Looking at various remains of different settlements, looking at the way that people are sometimes living in and among remains of old settlements and reusing them, looking at the use of oral history and material culture, the same way that we do it today, just doing it digitally, just accepting that, okay, the Dunmer of the Elder Scrolls franchise are a culture, or accepting that the people in Horizon Zero Dawn are a real culture that we should look at, instead of just like, she's really cool with her bow, we should just follow the main character on. It's like, no, it's part of a larger culture. Look at what she's wearing and why. And, and so, because, that one's definitely, there's this concept of there was a before and a now. And so, looking at all of that, that's kind of the third aspect, where it's literally just performing archaeology, but digitally. And what's really neat about these is that they don't have to live in isolation. You can kind of do them all. And And so, in a way, archaeologists can then be called on to help provide data for video games. And the whole video game world can be called on to help provide data for archaeologists, right? So you can make a better
Yes.
video game if
Yeah.
you understand experiential data, right? What daily life was like, what clothing, transportation, music, sounds, smells, colors, all this stuff, weather, right? That's what makes people say, that was really immersive and things like that. The same way that
Mm-hmm.
if someone's at a site, whenever I would do public archaeology and people come to the site, they were less interested in when I would say we found a building and it was this many feet by this many feet glazed. They wanted to know what were people doing in it, right? You've got to put the people back in the archaeology. Right. You're not really doing archaeology anymore. You're doing some other field.
Right.
And so, past landscape data adds to that too. And so at the same time, these ways of rendering and visualizing past data and landscapes can be used to then help understand. So we say, okay, we've got like 6 post holes here and we've got a hearth over there. We can use the techniques that designers are using in video games to try and digitally render what this building might have looked like. And then we can put this like 3D model into something like an AR app. And then people coming to the site can pull it up on their phone and can hold it up or on a tablet or something. And all of a sudden you can move it over. And you can be like, wow, so that's what a longhouse looked like. And now it's experiential. And so now it resonates.
And I really like that the field of archaeology is open to the idea of using game tech to create using what we would consider like a video game technology like the AR to create real world interaction between a visitor to a site and the site itself, like recreating the building or recreating the full Stonehenge or the full Mound City or something like that. I swear to God, we're gonna finish this. So okay, so we've talked about what ArchaeoGaming is and how open the term is. There's a collective out there that is the ArchaeoRPG, and they do a D&D game that is all archaeologists. They are not the same group that does the Welcome to Goblin Town group, who will be part of the con on Saturday night, so be sure to tune in for that. But one of the reasons the ArchaeoRPG group got together was because they wanted to study pen and paper games archaeologically as well, because a lot of we've been talking a lot about video games and archaeology because the video games are recreating a lived world, or at least the games we've been talking about are open world games where you can go and interact with the environment. But I want people to make sure that people understand that you can also study games like Asteroids or Space Invaders, or any game can potentially become the subject of archaeological study. And that includes board games, tabletop games, miniature games, analog style games. D&D, D&D being really close to my heart, I go to Gen Con every year, and I remember around the time of the 50th anniversary, they set up a museum section on the floor where you could go and you could see Gary Gygax's original notes for one of the original sessions he ran, and the hand-drawn map of the dungeon that he was taking his players through, and you could see the original dice that he used. And I mean, I'm putting it in air quotes because I have no way of verifying if they were original or not, but they were being presented in that way. But it was really kind of neat that Gen Con went through the effort of now Gary Gygax, of course, being one of the founders of D&D and the Gen Con convention itself. I thought it was cool that they went through the effort of putting together a museum space where participants could go and look and learn about the history of Gen Con and D&D. Granted, they're both games, but it's still passing on real world history that also built on game lore. And that's another aspect of ArchaeoGaming that I just want people to be aware of. we're going to be focusing mostly on games, on video games here, this convention, though. So, is there anything else you want people who are attending the con to know about ArchaeoGaming? Or is there something particular about what you researched that you really want to nerd out about and tell everybody about?
See, that's dangerous because we have a time limit.
We have time.
Left to my own devices, I could go on for hours. I mean, I literally give my students a project at the end of their Intro to Archaeology class every year that is to write about and then present on the intersection of archaeology and popular culture. And they can choose from whatever media sort of form they want, whether that is depictions in the news and whether that's print media or the television or things like that, or books or magazines or TV shows or video games. And I would say about 80 to 90% of them choose video games each time. And it's completely open to them. It's not like, hey, I study ArchaeoGaming, so you should do this to get an A. Like, no, not at all. People just choose to gravitate toward what they like. So, some of the English majors, unsurprisingly, right, looked and turned to literature and depictions of archaeology there, looked at things like Quartermain and things like that. But at the same time, some people even chose it as a learning opportunity where they were like, my boyfriend or my roommate is really into video games. And I was watching them the other day and I noticed some of the stuff we talked about in class was like kind of happening in the game. And so I was thinking, could I do that for my project? And I was like, yes, because what it's doing is it's causing them to look at the world around them and realize that like what they're holding, the tangible, is one of the things that could potentially get left behind. So that's already causing them to look with an archaeologist's eye. But then when they're looking at these depictions and they're thinking with an archaeologist's eye, when they're thinking, this guy went into, he was playing Call of Duty or whatever, and he went into like the shell of a building. And I was just thinking, I wonder what archaeologists would think about the fact that like this building is now being used as like a hideout when it was totally designed as an office building. And like, would archaeologists know that it was built as an office building, but then it was used for a bunch of guys to hide out and have like a gunfight in? And I was like, that is how you should be thinking. Like, that's amazing. And here it's just someone sitting watching someone else playing, Call of Duty or PUBG or anything like that, right? And that's just really exciting. And so,
it's neat that they're making that connection in your intro class.
But I mean, it's neat how often video games come up. And it's just that, I think that it's because, they're a lot more pervasive, I think, in our generation. And they also really are touching on our world in a lot more of a complex and holistic way than, and I'm not knocking it, but then something like Pong, right, where it's very narrow focused. And you have a very clear view, or something like Tetris, where you don't have these built landscapes that you can move around in. But as soon as there are things that have a built environment, and we as archaeologists study the use of the built environment, it clicks, right? And so that's something I guess you said, is there something you wanted to nerd out about? One thing I wanted to nerd out about is how amazing my students are, that like they're putting these connections together. And I'm sitting here and I'm sure they're all thinking like, oh, final paper sucked. But I'm sitting here, I'm like, this is amazing. I'm so proud of all of that, right? Because it's like, it's so cool to watch them get it. And to see that ArchaeoGaming has this power to get these big, important archaeological concepts that, the textbook and I have been like harping on about for a semester. And then it clicks one day, all of a sudden, when they're not excavating or, watching a slideshow about something, but when they're watching someone or they themselves are playing a video game. And I'm like, yes, that's why this field is so important. So that's like, if I can certainly go down the rabbit hole and happily nerd out, depending on how much time we have. But if that's something that I would so desperately want to point out, because it's amazing how it can click.
I want to ask you a question that's not going to seem related, I think, at first, but it will click, I promise. So, back when I was finishing up my master's, we did a lot of research on archaeology as storytelling, because we were discussing the prevalent inability of archaeologists to communicate with the greater public because we're boring. So, well, it only hurts because it's true. But there was a push in the late 90s, early 2000s for archaeology to go back to its storytelling roots and to make better storytellers out of archaeologists so that we could communicate what we were finding and why we were doing archaeology in an entertaining way to the public. And then games exploded. And the idea of having archaeology in a game kind of became a function. Like most of the games that I play, because I play a lot of open world games, have either an archaeology feature in the game itself, like as a skill set or as an interaction in the game, or they have an archaeologist character who is usually studying dinosaur bones because. But I'm thinking Red Dead Redemption 2. Apparently, the archaeologist in that wants you to find,
which is a little
dinosaur
much. I mean,
bones.
and yet
But
it
anyway.
does have some historical truth in that the first, female paleontologist was out in, one of the first was out in the American West. There was a female paleontologist out in the West. They're playing off of that, but they call it archaeology,
Yes.
which is annoying. But yes, anyways, please continue.
Exactly. No, but that's kind of where I'm going with that. Like, do you see the call for storytelling, the call of using archaeology as storytelling or storytelling as archaeology? Do you see that being represented in the games that you're studying?
I'm so sorry, but the camera went like. I'm so sorry. We can edit that part out.
No, it's not your fault. No. Keep going. No, this is in it.
Okay.
This is
Well,
part of
glitch
it now.
happens. That's what I always say. I want it on a T-shirt. But if you could just ask the question again, and hopefully it'll come through. Can you hear me? Okay, by the way. All right, cool. I
can hear you fine.
Just wanted to make sure, because every now and then my sound system goes out too, and my students are like, so.
Man, I can't imagine trying to
I've
teach
done it for over a year now.
Yeah, exactly. But my question was, do you see? Let me see if I can remember my question now. Do you see the call for archaeology using storytelling to communicate better? Do you see that being represented in video games? Especially the games that we're
and I'm so glad you repeated it, because it's actually a really good question, and I'm sorry the camera ate it the first. And honestly, it could have been. Well, I mean, it could have been camera glitch. Who knows? Maybe my dog sent off sleepy waves and put my camera to sleep or something. But so there's always, I feel like, this sort of call for storytelling, and you gave a really good background to it. And as a historical archaeologist, it's something that really resonates with me because, Jim Dietz, one of our big, our big founders in our field, right? He had always pointed out the fact that don't lie, but make it compelling, right? And that, you don't want to be like, oh, yes, there was a family of 7 that lived here and they had 3 dogs, 2 cats, and a horse. When you have like 3 pots and a spoon, like you can't do that. But at the same time, if you've got the assemblage to speak to it, if you can pull that evocative information out, you're going to resonate in so much more compelling terms with anyone.
You make it
right, exactly. You're going to make it immersive to people that are interested and to fellow archaeologists, right? So that they're not attending your conference, people are like nodding off, right? And all of that stuff too. It's something that historical archaeology has, in a way, we've got a benefit too, where you're not trying to be like, please be interested in this rock. Like, I'm really interested in this rock. It's got this chip right here. I promise it's cool. Like, we can hold up a bottle, and most people are like, that looks like a bottle. So we have that benefit, but at the same time, you can hold up some broken pieces of bottles, and people are like, the bottle, I don't care. So you do still need to put it together.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, your question really resonates as a historical archaeologist. I think that need for storytelling is certainly there. I see it less so much as storytelling and more as the crafting of a narrative that is based on sort of little like paving stones or garden stones of data, where like all we're doing is like, in a garden, unlike big stepping stones across like some swamp or something where you can sink and get like really murky, and I've certainly done survey there and hated it, right? Like when you have stepping stones in a garden, right? If you miss you just get a little muddy. You don't, things don't get chaotic, right? And so the point is that you're asking people to take little jumps, little leaps of faith, if you will, from stepping stone to stepping stone. So you can say, look, we've got this data and this data and this data. Follow me, and you're putting it together in a way. And honestly, that's kind of what I feel like medical doctors would do too, where they're like, we've got this and this and this, and so we're coming to this diagnosis. Follow me on this little stepping stone path of data to the final diagnosis. And so I feel like, as far as ArchaeoGaming is concerned, it absolutely still fits in as completely imperative, because gaming, whether it's a tabletop game or whether it's a video game, or anything else that you might want to lump into play that we may be studying as it also connects with archaeology, is inherently about some sort of story that's being told, or some sort of reason. Even, I know I mentioned Pong, but there's a reason. Why are you playing Pong? Well, you're playing against the opponent and the goal is to win. And what are you playing? You're playing this sports game in an arena, like, even if the arena is completely fictional and in your head and all you see is just tink, 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 right? You can simulate, what it's supposed to look like, right? You can watch the Olympics and you can see tennis going on or ping pong and you can be like, yes, I know what it's supposed to look like. I can extrapolate. That power to extrapolate is what we need as archaeologists, and it's what makes video games powerful. And so if we can do both with our data sets that we are pulling from the digital world, that we are pulling from gaming data, and we can put it together in a way that makes sense, that is when I think we will have our strongest amount of power into really being able to state what it is that we're researching, and to be able to get people to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, as opposed to, you are crazy, which is never something that you want like a fellow researcher or the general public to think.
I mean, my big thing is pseudo-archaeology, so I'm kind of used to that. I am not myself a pseudo-archaeologist, but I do study pseudo-archaeology, so I understand the whole why are you doing this again? So I get that, which is also a natural shift into ArchaeoGaming, in my opinion. But, all right, I'm going to give you the heads up that this is time for final thoughts. This has been a fabulous interview, and I really appreciate it. And the fact that you're a teacher really shines through. Your students are very lucky, in my opinion.
I'm honored for the opportunity to be able to speak about my research, to be able to have this opportunity to talk about it, to be able to talk with you, to have this platform. So I'm incredibly grateful. So thank you.
I'm grateful that you took the time and all through the technical difficulties have stuck with this. But what are your final thoughts on A, ArchaeoGaming, and B, the value of an ArchaeoGaming con? I'm going to put you on the mark here now.
So I would say that the value of ArchaeoGaming, the value of ArchaeoGaming Con, they go together, right? So the value of ArchaeoGaming, we've kind of talked about it again and again, right? But it's this ability, but it's fine. It's this ability to be able to look at the built environment in a different way. It's the ability to recognize that we are producing material culture and we are producing digital artifacts that need to be studied the same way that nobody would just shake their head at us if we said, oh yes, I found this ancient Roman gaming piece. Nobody would be like, well, that's really weird. Why did you find that on a dig? Like, you'd be like, because it was in the dirt, right? Like, it's there. Nobody thinks that that's odd. And yet we as humans are creating all of these artifacts. There's already games that people have never heard of. And they're like, oh, well, it was just a little thing that I really loved back in the 1970s. You'll hear someone saying it's gone now. There's games that are not backwards compatible. So there's things that are already archaic and unable to be used. There's powerful nostalgia that brings them back so that you can now play Sega Genesis games either on like a brand new kind of a little console thing that you can plug in that only has Sega Genesis games loaded to it, or that you can buy Sega Genesis games to play on your PlayStation. Like, that's amazing, but we have antiquated material culture. We've got antiquated material culture. We've got things that already, if someone were to hold up some of the controllers or things like that, there are people who would be like, I have no idea what that is, unless you knew video games really, really well. And so already we're getting this disconnect, which means already it's time that we need to study it. So that's the first thing right there. Just looking at the hard
Right.
data, that physical data, that meatscape data. But we're creating.
And it's such a
Yes.
chunk of culture, especially, I mean, just talking from like North American aspects, it is a huge part of
And
North American culture. Games in general. I mean, like I just went to a pinball convention,
yeah,
and the original pinball games are there, like the gravity fed, no bells, no whistles. It's just a little ball that it kind of looks like
I mean, there's
pachinko,
the
but it's
Pinball
not.
Wizard, right? The whole musical. I mean, like there are these phenomena that
Exactly.
take place, and it's not just here. I mean, we've also got, in China and Japan and Korea, you've got all these big video game production centers that are rivaling, North America and such. And then you've got, the company that purchased Oregon Trails out of France, so you've got things all over the and
Oh
because
yeah.
more and
Yeah,
more
yeah.
as we're increasingly just global society, right? That it's not even like, well,
Hmm.
this is North American versus this is Japanese. It's kind of like, okay, cool, the North American release is here, and the Japanese release, or even sometimes they would say the Asian mega server is doing that, and so there's this and there's that, and so. But even if you look beyond the material culture, if you look at the fact that we are producing, we're spending hours of labor, human labor, to produce
Hmm.
a lot of digital artifacts, whether it is wikis or it is Discord servers to
Yep.
go along with various guilds, or whether it is um, gaming guides, or whether it is compendiums for lore for either the Elder Scrolls, or for this franchise or for that franchise. I mean, there are people out there who are really
Well, and then you've got fan
right.
art.
Exactly, you've
You've
got
got the
something that
fan
goes
the fan
with it,
fictions. People write about their
fan fiction that
characters,
ends up
all
going
that
with
stuff.
various characters and things like that. And then you've got the
Yep.
fact that now you've got a lot of the companies reaching back out digitally to say, well, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and we have our own Discord now. And then
Hmm.
there's help forums where people can track bugs, and people can say, look, until the server gets a patch for this particular game, here's a workaround, or until PlayStation does this, I found that you can do that, or oh yeah, it is backwards compatible, but you have to set your settings to this. So there's all this community information, and so, and again, I'm not slamming anything. I mean, I feel
Exactly.
like every online game has patching, and every no matter, yeah, I just want to make
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
so I'm not coming for
Yeah,
anybody.
we're
I
not
play a
coming
lot of
for
online
anybody.
games. You have to patch it. It's a living thing, but that's just it. You have to patch it, right? It gets
Yeah,
stale and it gets old, and so
exactly.
you
And
have
it
to patch
changes
it.
the
And so if you
game.
have to patch something, whether it be a tire because you're constantly using it, or a game, right? You're constantly attending to it and putting work in, and it takes so much work to maintain the
Hmm.
servers, to take the servers down, and then if there's a problem, you have to localize it, identify it, fix it, put it up. That's so much specialization, that's so much knowledge that goes in there. And while
Hmm.
you may have a bunch of fans that are really angry and like, I want my game back, you're like, they're so angry because they can't play. So you're doing something right. If you take the server down and people notice, right, you're doing something right.
True.
But all of that is material culture in a way too. The servers are material culture. There's all the digital signatures. There's what are
Right.
you taking away with the patch? What are you putting in? And so,
Right. And the code itself. I mean, I've known a couple people in the ArchaeoGaming
yes,
field that study
exactly.
the code. So like that's what they're looking. They're looking for that patch. They're looking for that bug. They're looking at the code, not the
Right,
front or the front end product that I'm interacting with. They're looking
right,
at
exactly.
the deep stuff, and that blows my mind because I can't do that part. But yeah, there's people that are looking at that, and like you said, that's material culture. It needs to be preserved.
There's
It
digital
changes. It's a
artifacts, and
living
the game
thing.
that you play, whether it's an MMO or whether it is, they've just remastered not too long ago. They remastered the Spyro games, right? So the original game versus the one now. The
Yeah.
one now like looks so much crisper, and yet it still has that nostalgic feel. And yet playing them side by side, you can see the difference. And so, what did they change? What did
Right.
they take out? What did they add? Anything that is sort of on the cutting room floor, so to speak. Those are artifacts, even if they're wholly digital.
Hmm. 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 Yep. And that takes us into a whole other field of archaeology, which is digital archaeology, which is trying to preserve all this stuff, and that's too much for this conversation.
Yeah, no,
but it exists.
And
I
it
want people to know.
intersects too. You know?
Oh yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on and doing the first presentation for the con for 2021.
I
can you
cannot
believe that we are in 2021?
I did want to.
August
You had
of
said at the
2021.
very beginning when we were talking that nerd things were encouraged, so I wanted to show you the nerd thing. My wife got me
Nerd
this
things
for
are
my
always
birthday. It
encouraged.
says M Tank, hold aggro.
Oh my god, it's a calico.
I play a tank in all of the sort of raids / trials that I do, and so I thought I would at least show that off.
I love it so much.
You know, I have to
Where'd
ask her. We get each
that?
other gaming things all the time. The other one when we had our second anniversary, which is technically cotton, is like the theme. I got these, which is level 2 complete.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, so
Oh,
I'm a big nerd. But I thought since
Those
you
are
had said
adorable. I love
nerdiness
those.
encouraged, I figured I would bring out my level 2 complete, even though we are now past level 2, and my M Tank hold aggro shirt. So.
My goal for maybe next year, because maybe next year we can all be in the same space and not worry about everyone dying. I really want to have people like cosplay next year. I want them to dress up as their characters and stuff. Yeah, I wanted to do it this year, but it just didn't come through. So next year, assuming there's a 2022, look for costumes in that one. But again, thank you very much for coming on. Thank you for letting me interview you. Thank you for participating in my con, and I'm gonna let you go now.
Absolutely. Oh, he's good. At least he slept during it, which was good. I was worried he might be like barking.
He did. Good dog.